I'm Debbie Bradford. I am co-chair of the English and Humanities Department. I'm a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and Center for Teaching, who along with SGA are bringing you this event today and feeding you. And I'm going to introduce to you our speaker. This is Professor John Johnson. He's a professor of astronomy at Harvard. Among his many achievements, like discovering a few planets, and being the first African American to receive tenure in the physical sciences at Harvard, he's also been recognized for his outstanding teaching. He was awarded the Fannie Cox Prize for Excellence in Science Teaching at Harvard, the Richard P. Feynman Prize for Excellence in Teaching at Caltech, and the UC Berkeley Teaching Effectiveness Award. In addition to his teaching and research, he works to create opportunities for historically underrepresented minorities in higher education. He's the founder and director of the Harvard Banneker Institute, which is a summer program designed to prepare students of color who are seeking to pursue a PhD in astrophysics. Today's event is going to be a dialogue rather than a speech. We encourage you to write down questions you have for Professor Johnson on the index cards that are on the seats. There should be cards and pencils around. If you need more, you can wave your hand and someone will magically come bring you some. I'm going to get us started with the first few questions, and then in a little while, a couple of the diversity committee members are going to walk around and begin collecting your questions. And then before we get started, I'm also going to introduce Marguerite Gowen, also co-chair of the English and Humanities Department and on the same committees that I already mentioned. All right, so please welcome John Johnson. All right, so first question for you. What was your journey through academia to this point?
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, just a little bit there. So yeah, a lot of people ask me how is it that I got into doing astronomy, and I say that it was basically a random walk through education. When I graduated from high school, I kind of went on to, I had a friend who was at an engineering school at the University of Missouri, and he said, engineering's pretty cool, and after you finish, you can get a really good paying job. And I said, okay, that sounds good to me. I don't know what else to do. And so I basically followed him there. And I started off doing engineering, and I just found that it wasn't very exciting or engaging. It just wasn't really, it didn't really fit for whatever reason. I switched to a different kind of engineering, and found the same sort of thing. And then I took an engineering physics class, where for the first time, I really felt challenged, and I really liked the material in it. So I don't know what it was about blocks sliding down inclined planes, but something about that really engaged my brain. And before I knew it, I was a physics major. And I got my bachelor's degree in physics from the University of Missouri. And I was still on a sort of, I felt like I was on a treadmill. There was this, like, I didn't really want to go out and get a job. I knew that. I didn't want to work a 9 to 5. I didn't like waking up early in the morning. And I heard that graduate school is a nice next step. And so I applied to graduate schools. And I thought I was going to be a physicist, just like I thought I was going to be an engineer. And just like then, I was wrong again. And I applied to one astronomy program at the urging of my undergraduate advisor. And he said, I know a person at UC Berkeley. I think that it would be a good place for you to be. I think you'd be well supported. And I said, okay. And I'd never taken an astronomy class. I had no background in it. But at his urging, I finally submitted my application. I actually, to be honest with everyone here, I just literally copy-pasted my UCLA physics application over to UC Berkeley astronomy, and I just submitted it like right before the deadline. And as it turns out, that was the first place that called me and said, hey, we would like to have you in our program. And I went and visited the campus. It was in California. It was a beautiful spring day. There were people, beautiful girls sunbathing out on the lawn. And I was just like, this looks pretty good to me. I guess I'll have to learn a new subject again. And I went ahead and did that. And it was not easy. It was really challenging making the step from a very small state campus to this sort of prestigious university. It felt like this gigantic jump up in the level of the material and how much it was challenging me, and also just having a sense that I really belonged there. I felt like it was an accident that I had been admitted, and so that sort of hung over me the whole time I was there. But I'm stubborn, and I stuck with it, and I eventually graduated with my PhD. And from there, I went to get a postdoctoral position in Hawaii, which was pretty sweet. I spent 2 years there, and then I got a professorship at Caltech, and I spent 4 years there, and then I eventually found myself at Harvard. And I really think that it's not a process that a lot of students ask, like, do you see yourself as a role model, or is that something I could follow? And I'm like, yeah, maybe you could, but it was so random for me that I think that it highlights more what you can do if you kind of keep your pathway open and you stay sort of attuned to the opportunities as they present themselves. And I think that that's the thing that I had, is I positioned myself to get lucky. That's what I do. And I often encourage my students that luck is a real skill to develop. I don't think people really think that way, but if you feel like, oh, I don't really see how I could possibly succeed, or I don't really see a pathway, then when an opportunity flashes up before you, or maybe lands in your lap, you won't really be ready for it. But I really think that if you are open and something lands in your lap, you're like, oh, that looks interesting. What is that? And then you might follow that pathway. So I think that's what I did.
Cool. And it really worked out, obviously, because you've had a really successful career as an astrophysicist. But because you're an astrophysicist, I have to ask you, how did you become interested in issues of race?
Yeah, well, I think there's two ways to approach that. First is that I think my pathway into science taught me how to be curious and to not be satisfied with stock answers if you ask a question. And the question that started popping up into my mind as I climbed the sort of the academic ladder is that I started seeing fewer and fewer black people. Just straight up, like that's just the thing that I observed, is that I increasingly was the only one in the room. And so that popped a question into my mind. It's sort of like my thesis work was on, where is it that we find the most planets? What kinds of stars host planets most frequently, so that we know where to find more planets? And what does that tell us about planet formation? And then another question came up, which was, where are all the black people? And it never occurred to me to not structure that as a scientific question. But when I asked other people, they had these very weak sauce answers that were just very unsatisfying, that didn't really seem to get at a fundamental truth that could be like, this led to this, or this is structured like this. It was just more like, oh, I guess it's that black people are just not as interested in things like astronomy. Or maybe it's because they come from less affluent backgrounds. They don't have the luxury of doing something like that. They have to go and become doctors or lawyers. And I was kind of like, yeah, but then that opens up other questions. Like, why is it that they come from less affluent backgrounds? Or why is it that you believe that people who have slightly different features and skin tone have different interests about the nature of the universe, which seems to be pretty fundamental? And so I just didn't like the answers. And so I just started digging around. And it's the kind of person that I am, is that when I latch onto a question, it's kind of like a pit bull. Like my jaw locks onto it, and then I don't let go until I'm sort of satisfied with a logical, sort of self-consistent answer.
That's kind of what you came and talked to the faculty about last year, right? Was that question. And one of the things you talked to us about in that presentation was really, what is race?
Yeah, that was really fascinating to me. I found it really fascinating to discover that stars have planets, just like our sun has planets, and our sun is a star. That was fascinating and sort of unexpected. And then when I asked the question about, like, where are all the black folks, it led to this question of, what does it mean to be black? Like, what is black versus white? versus the various kinds of brown? Why is it that some races are denoted by color and other races are denoted by continent? There are Asians and Asian Americans. But Asia is a really big place. There's a lot of different kinds of people there. It became curious to me, as it did to my son, when we were once watching a basketball game. Back in the day, we were watching a Clippers game. And he marveled at how Blake Griffin seems to be like one of the only really good white players on the team. And I had to break it to him that Blake Griffin he's black. And he just looked at me, he's like, wait, you mean like you and Papa? And I was like, yeah, he's black. And he's like, but he's not black. And I was like, well, I'm not black like Papa, am I? And then he kind of paused and thought about it. And he was like, oh yeah, he's way darker than you. And so this idea that like somehow we know what a black person is not something that comes innately to us. My son had to learn that. I had to teach him that, which is odd. If it's an actual like biological thing, it should just be this immutable, readily recognizable thing. But as I dug around, I found out that even the definition of what is black is something that's changed in time, and it changes from place to place. As a matter of fact, like I can get on a plane and I fly to Nigeria. The moment I get off the plane, I'm not black there. I'm distinctly not black. Whereas a person from Nigeria comes here, they get off the plane and suddenly they are black. And so that was fascinating. And so when I dug into that, I started uncovering the nature of race is not a biological thing. As a matter of fact, there's been a lot of energy that's been invested into places like Harvard in the late 1800s and in the early 20th century. It was really invested into determining what is race and being able to deterministically separate out races. And they failed. They failed utterly. It's actually an embarrassment that still stains the profession of science, that so much time and energy was spent on something that ultimately failed. It's not biological. The pigmentation of my skin is a biological manifestation, but I cannot give you a description of somebody and have you be able to successfully link it back uniquely to a race. Similarly, if you take a genetic set of markers, you can't trace that back to a race. You can't even really get back to a specific region on the earth. So what is it then? I was left with this, well, I thought it was biological. I thought I was born to be black. And as it turns out, no, that varies. And so that led me into finding out that race is a constructed thing. You know, people in the audience might have heard that race is a social construct. But then as a scientist, I wasn't satisfied with that. Like, I could point to this table and tell you, this is a construct. Well, okay. If you've never seen a table, that's not a very satisfying answer. Then you might want to know, like, why was it constructed? Why did somebody manufacture this thing out of plastic and metal to be here? I mean, well, there's lots of different reasons that you can give, but ultimately you land on, this is a table. It's a piece of furniture. It was constructed for a reason. And the same thing goes for race.
Well, now you have to answer, why was it constructed?
Sure. So it was that. Let me see if I can find the shorter answer to that. We can explore it as necessary. But when people came from outside of the American continent, from Europe, they came as, well, sort of European people. They came as Germans. They came as English people. They came as the Irish in those early days. And the majority of those people who came were indentured servants. They were the poorest and the most wretched of the working people. And their indentured servitude is, I learned in my history classes, that was a 7-year period, and at the end of it, they essentially purchased their freedom through their labor. But in the 1600s, people didn't live the 7 years. They worked in conditions that left them exposed to disease, starvation, the elements. They generally died, so they were essentially slaves for the period of time that they lived. And those were people they were the first boats packed with people taken from the continents. The first people stolen were taken from places along the Rhine River in Germany. They were taken from Ireland. They were taken from the what we recognize now as the European continent. And then sprinkled among them were also people stolen and taken from Italy. And all of those people were kind of thrust into this horrible condition of being workers, where their labor was enriching an elite few. And just like any group of human beings that are subjected to that kind of condition, they resisted. European folks and African folks together fought and resisted this the state that they found themselves in. They wanted their freedom. And because the elite few were only a few, and they were vastly outnumbered, they needed a way of controlling this workforce. And the way that they did that is to take the African people who could not assimilate into society if they were to get their freedom, if they were to escape. They separated them out and said, these people will be permanently in this indentured servitude or chattel slavery. And this other group of poor working folks, once they eventually were able to live out their 7 years and weren't basically fraudulently put into another 7 years, that they got their freedom and had a small farm and they lived in poverty in this new continent, they were given this sort of gift, this differentiation. They said, you are now white. You're just like the elite few. And you can be like them. Look at you, look alike. And so even though their position in life was only just above those thrust into chattel slavery, they were not doing much better. They were able to be enlisted in essentially controlling the slave population. They became people who were part of the slave patrols. They were people who were tasked with finding escaped slaves and returning that stolen property. And they were told that they were white. They didn't come here as white. That was something that had to be constructed. And you can find that when you trace the early laws within this country. There was a change from moving from referring to Christian men or Christian European men into this new language of white men. And that is where the origin comes from. It's basically a divide and conquer strategy that persists today. It's still effective today in that same thing. It's that there are poor people across the country, black poor people, white poor people, Latino poor people, indigenous poor people, and they have throughout history been prevented by one way or another from joining forces to resist their condition by convincing them that they are these different people that are antagonistic towards each other.
So, is this working? Closer?
Yeah.
So in discussions of social justice, there seems to be disagreement about the importance of race versus class. In your opinion, is one more important than the other, or more productive to talk about than the other?
I think that there is a tendency in American thought to be quite binary and to be zero-sum. Which is to say that if I'm to pay attention to one thing, then I must necessarily give zero to the other, or even negative to the other,
Right.
so that these must sum to be nothing. And I have really had to work in my own life to overcome this thinking that I've been brought up in. And when I first became aware of race and racism and the way that it affected me personally, my sole focus was on the nature of race and racism. And I saw this as the only organizing principle, the only thing that mattered. I got make it free. But then it became quite challenging to think of the fact that by number, there are more white people in this country living in poverty than there are black people. Now, disproportionately by fraction, black people are, a factor of 10, have a factor of 10 less wealth than the average white family. But by number, the vast majority of people in the country are white. And how do I come to terms with that? I mean, they're not doing great through a lot of America. And so that led me to past historical movements where you find that, for example, Martin Luther King at the end of his life, he moved from being focus primarily on racial injustice to moving towards organizing what was going to be 500,000 poor people who were going to march on Washington and set up camp on the White House lawn. And that was going to be a major mass movement that went across all lines. It was indigenous people, it was Mexican immigrants, it was black folks, it was white working poor. And that was, when that happened, that is when the powers that be in this country first, they really faced a real crisis. When it was anti-racism work, solely it was a threat to the organizing principles in certain areas of the country, but the government became under siege and under threat by this mass workers movement. And that was really interesting to see in his later speeches and the things that he was doing in organizing in Memphis for the sanitation workers, for example, to see that that was really a class movement. That was saying that we should challenge the fact that there is such a vast number of people with approximately nothing and a few elite who have almost everything.
Right.
Why aren't we focusing there? What is it that we mean by racial justice? Does that mean that a couple of black folks get to be among the elite few while the rest still stay cast down among the many? Is that what justice looks like? Well, the answer that a lot of people during that era came to, and throughout history what black people have come to, is that no, that's not what it's going to look like. Now, it's not to say that everyone came to this conclusion, but that is the conclusion that I've really come to, is that race is really a way of codifying a permanent lower class and to divide that lower class from other lower class. And I think that if we neglect class in discussions of justice in this country, then we're going to really miss it. If we focus solely on, let's say, just identity, then you're not going to get the whole picture. I like that question. Thank you.
So before I ask another question, anyone who does have a question written down, please kind of hold it up in the air so that one of our helpers can come grab it from you. And please feel free to write down questions whenever and just kind of raise them up in the air and someone will grab them. What is the Black radical tradition, and why is it, or how is it related to Black History Month?
Yeah. So you invited me here, and the opportunity presented itself as being part of Black History Month. It's about the month of February. It's really important first to say that Black history is American history fundamentally. It's just that it is the history that is too often neglected. I grew up not by default in my classrooms learning about what Black history looks like, but my own history looks like. And because the United States began in its origins as divided along class lines, and it's persisted today, there is a separation between those groups of people, but we've all been here together, occupying this country, being a part of this country. And so the Black radical tradition is something that I stumbled onto simply by virtue of asking the questions that I was asking. And when I asked questions about the nature of race, what does racism look like, what is systemic racism, what does it mean for a group of people to have, in a median term, so much less than others, what has that looked like throughout history? Then I started uncovering the writings of Black authors, for example. And I have to admit to the people in this room, I'm not coming to you as if I was born with some vast amount of knowledge about all of this. I lived most of my life without ever reading a single Black author. And that there are some Black folks who grew up in a tradition and within their household of always doing that. But I stumbled upon the work of James Baldwin. I asked the question of well, I've heard a couple of lines from Martin Luther King, but what did he actually say in those speeches? I came across the work of Angela Davis and the struggle that she did in the late 1970s when she was, subjected to as a political prisoner. She was imprisoned unlawfully and fought for her own freedom in conditions that I can't even imagine. But that happened in my lifetime. That's not distant history. And so when I found these people throughout time, 1980, Assata Shakur, going back to the 1960s with Martin Luther King and people like Huey Newton, going back towards Marcus Garvey, going back to Ida B. Wells. I was finding people who were speaking not in terms that were unfamiliar in a distant path. It sounded like they were talking about things that I was experiencing right now. And that was exciting, that was exhilarating to me. It was like uncovering this alternate history of sorts. I grew up reading science fiction, some fantasy, and some alternate history, some things like the Man in the High Tower, which envisioned what would it have been like in the United States if they had lost World War II. It's an alternate history timeline. Well, I felt like I was uncovering a real life alternate history of the timeline that showed that when human beings throughout history have been subjected to oppression, they don't take it lying down, and it doesn't matter what their skin color is. But the people who are my ancestors most certainly did not take it lying down. There were slave rebellions every year that rocked this country, that put the people who were holding them in chains and fear on a constant, ongoing basis. I learned about the Haitian Revolution, the establishment of the first black nation in this part of the world. It came from organized resistance and a vision of freedom that is really inspiring, and it should be inspiring to all people who look to the American Revolution as this inspiring moment. Well, how about the Haitian Revolution? There are people there who were actually in chains, who were actually enslaved, not figuratively, but they were to work until they were dead with no hope of freedom, and they still saw hope, and they still found a way to not just overcome that, but to form an entire nation. And so that was something that really ignited a fire in me. And once that had happened, I accidentally found that there's a name for this. There's a name for this uncovering of the history. There's this name of discovering who you are. And it's called the Black Radical Tradition. There's no card that I carry. I didn't apply for and gain access to it. I found myself there as a human being. And in so doing, I actually started finding real pieces of myself. And so that's what I refer to as it is kind of a peculiar intersection I found myself in as an academic. An astrophysicist on one hand, somebody who uses the largest telescopes in the world, looks for planets around other stars, and also somebody who is digging to uncover this history of resistance in this country, which is very exciting.
So you said as you were doing the research, you were seeing that a lot of things back then are still applicable today.
Mm-hmm.
And Martin Luther King spoke of the triple-pronged sickness of America. What were the prongs?
Yeah.
And are they still around today?
Yeah, so there was a speech that he gave in, this is moving towards late in his work, so I think it was 1966, 1967, when he spoke very bluntly about what he saw as sort of the three evils that were plaguing American society. And he named them as racism, which, I think everybody knows that's something that he fought against. But he also named materialism and militarism. And he saw these problems on the same plane. It was occupying the same sort of space, and they were very much interrelated. He raised the issue of materialism because he saw an American society that was moving more and more towards people finding their value in things. Mm-hmm. And that was not necessarily something that people came to on their own, but that was being driven by the socioeconomic system of our country that was really needing to continually generate new profit. And the only way to do that at a time when people and workers were becoming more and more efficient at producing things, the value of those things was decreasing. Therefore, the amount of profit that can be brought in from selling those things decreased. So what you needed to do is get people to buy more things. And this is really just related to the nature of our market economy that he saw as driven by sort of a selfish pursuit of personal gain. And then he also noted militarism. This is a time when the Vietnam War was raging and young people from poor communities across the country were being sent to die for a cause that was not really well articulated. It was not very clear why we were even bothering to fight in Vietnam. And the people who were there fighting that war were the people who were actually leading the anti-war movement. It was the soldiers on the ground that formed the first anti-war movement in this country. And that was another thing that I found surprising. I've always thought it was like the hippies of the university campuses here. No, those people were following the lead of the people who were going to fight because, again, they're human beings on another country dying for something that didn't look like it made any sense. And again, that they found themselves in this horrible condition and they fought against it, just as the Vietnamese were fighting against it. And so he saw that there was a linkage among all of these things. The Vietnam War was producing vast profits for a military-industrial complex. Every bomb that was dropped needed to be replaced with a new one. That was a good way of selling things to the government and basically bringing in the tax dollars to pay for it. And that money that was being used to wage that war, those millions upon millions of tens of millions of hundreds of billions of dollars that were being spent on that war, he saw that that was money that could be spent to bring people out of poverty here. And that the gains that had been made from the New Deal and the Fair Deal were being rolled back because the Vietnam War was sucking up all of the resources of the country. And so he saw all of these interlinked things and he named them and said that, this was actually one of the, this is a very important sort of class plus race analyses that was happening. And I think I really encourage everyone here to go look up that speech. You can just actually Google search Martin Luther King triple prong, and you'll find that speech. So yeah. So do we have some questions?
I have so many questions that I just have to, just kind of pick one.
All right, well, how about this one?
Okay, sure.
Do that one? Go ahead.
No, I said okay to you.
Do you believe that privilege exists as a concept? And if so, should the ones with privilege have to, looks like it says give work to those without privilege?
Oh yeah. I think that in modern day sort of social justice circles, there's a lot of talk about privilege, and I think it's really important that when we talk about privilege versus oppression, it's like, to what end? Why are we naming these things?
It's binary.
It's binary or zero-sum thinking that but also it kind of ends up in this weird condition where it's like, shall we identify the person with the least privilege and everybody else should be labeled as problematic and excluded from this space? Like to what end are we doing this? And I think that naming privilege is a way of highlighting the way that that race, for example, works to produce a permanent underclass, the way that it produces antagonisms between people that might otherwise be working together. It highlights the way that, the same ways that homophobia operates within our country, again, to divide. It focuses people's energy and attention away from the actual issues into issues of identity. And so I think that it's good to note that there are people with privileged positions. But that is not the end product of that analysis. That analysis should sort of highlight that where there exists privilege, the other side of that is that there exists oppression. And that we should care about that as human beings. We shouldn't care about that to get political points. We should care about that because we know that there are people in the room who are moving through this world differently than other people in the room. Now, as for what we should be doing with that, I think there are opportunities to leverage that, to essentially, as a man, I wake up each morning and I'm basically paid a dividend for being a man in this country. And then that puts me in a position of privilege relative to a woman. Now, does that mean that I should lay prostrate on the floor and ask for forgiveness for having this privilege? No, look, I woke up in the morning, I was handed this payment, right? I see it as my job is to pay that down whenever I have an opportunity, to leverage that, to take other human beings who are around me and make sure that they have an easier time moving through this world, so that they might then be motivated to work. We all might be motivated to work together to change this system. And that's like the radical part. This radical tradition is not just a black tradition. The black part is just signifying that this is what black people have been doing as a radical movement in this country. But radicalism has existed in a lot of different spheres in this country. And radicalism is really just focused on not reforming the country as it is, but taking a look at it and saying there are fundamental flaws here that are embedded into the very social fabric, and that we need to change that fundamentally. And we're not going to get there by sitting around in a room and pointing fingers and saying that you have more privilege than the next person. That's not going to get us to that end. It's simply a tool to raise awareness at the most basic level that not all people in this country are treated equally, even though I believe that they are created equally.
All right, so this is a question from someone in the audience. I'm teaching my children to see a person as a person without categorizing them. What else do you think I could teach my children to change? What else do you think I could teach my children to change the future for the better?
I think that that is an aspirational thing that you're teaching them. That's something that would be great to aim for, but it doesn't speak to reality as it is in this country. That all people are seen as people. We would love to have it that way, but by taking a sort of colorblind position is not going to change the material conditions for black folks in like West Baltimore or Southside Chicago or living in the Bronx, living in such poverty that it's difficult to feed their children. And that condition of those people who are living in the ghetto, there's a narrative within this country that we get what we deserve by virtue of the hard work that we put in. It's this myth of a meritocracy that exists. But the fact of the matter is that I got people who live right in my neighborhood who work 2 jobs every single day of the week, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and they're still in poverty, all right? I would say if people deserve it, it's that person across the street from me that drives an Uber in the evening and works as a janitor in the morning. Like, that, the fact of the matter is that it would be great to see people as just people, but we live in a racialized society. It's embedded into the fabric as a historical theme that has run through and has never been adequately addressed. And so when people take a radical stance towards that, it's basically kind of looking at that cold truth in the eye and saying that's the actual reality. And I think that that's the other thing that needs to be taught to our children. That's something that I teach to my children, is that we are fighting for a world where people can just be people. But more than that, where people have their basic human needs met as a human right. That you don't have to work for somebody else in order to have food, in order to have a place to live, to have clean water, to live in a place where there's clean air, to be able to raise a family in a loving environment. Those are basic human needs that are presently not met, and they're not met disproportionately for certain sectors of our society. And that is a situation that is not only not right, in my view, it's completely untenable. This will not last this way for long. And the question is, what direction are we going to go? Are we going to go in a reactionary way, where it says that we need to double down, we need to blame the poor people for what is going on in the country? Or are we going to go a different way? Are we going to go in a direction that says that we all got to get free from this? All right, unless you're out here in the audience and you happen to be a billionaire, you're not getting the best of what could be in this country, period, all right? And so there are people who believe that that is a fair existence, as a fair way of structuring the society. And it's like, okay, cool, like speak that out loud and defend it. I'll have that conversation with you. But don't hide it behind this idea that we actually live in a place where you could work hard and then become that millionaire. Like, come on. There's a structure here that doesn't move very well. So I think that's the other side of it, is aspire to what that person just said, but also speak the truth as it is on the ground.
There's someone who would like you to address the Black Lives Matter movement. Someone.
Yeah, I like that. It's a card that just, it says Black Lives Matter on it. As a statement, I agree. You know, that's something I will profess until the day I die, is that black folks do matter. Now, why is it that we need to make that statement? Why is there a movement that is declaring this? And that's because it simply doesn't get echoed back by the rest of society. It doesn't get echoed back in their words, but it also doesn't get echoed back in the structure of things. All right, it is, in my view, fundamentally not okay for a police officer to kill a human being and that not be investigated, that person not be held to account for doing that. And it is not okay for that investigation to conclude that that was a murder and then that person get paid leave. That is just not okay. It's not okay. And that not only happens to black people in this country, that's a thing that needs to be reckoned with, is that what the Black Lives Matter movement is saying is that we need to start here for these people at the lowest rung, but it's white folks that are getting killed by police too, right? There is a video you can watch of a man in a hotel in Las Vegas who is made to lay down on the ground, put his hands out, and the police are screaming at him to get down, and they eventually just shoot him, right? That is not okay. And that, to turn a blind eye to that, to say that, well, you know, there must have been a reason for it, nah, okay? But that extends further from that. It extends further into the realm where, again, as I was saying, it is not okay to work two jobs and not be able to feed your family, all right? It is not okay to be permanently put into a position of poverty. And it extends to a lot of areas of life where access to healthcare, access to basic needs are not being met. And so it's just a rallying cry that says that we need to just simply wake up and recognize this. And it is largely directed towards white America. The way I see it is that white folks are dying because they're not recognizing that this is happening nationwide. When all of the attention is focused on the notion of black crime or black drug abuse or black deaths due to the violence that comes attendant to poverty, what it's doing is it's shielding the fact that that's actually ongoing, happening in poor white communities as well. And again, that's that divide and conquer that's going on. And so there are elements of people who are involved in that movement who would like to separate black people into a different sort of nation and as a part, but the vast majority of the people I've interacted with within the Black Lives Matter movement are looking to get all people free. And I think that that's really key, and I'm really hoping that this movement is sustained and not absorbed into Main Street politics. There's some of that going on, as there will be with any resistance movement. That's a good way of defeating things, is to just subsume it into the current presidential race, for example. So yeah, I mean, those are the initial thoughts that come when I see a card with Black Lives Matter.
So I assume Black Lives Matter is part of the Black radical tradition?
I think it grows out from that. You can think of the I think of the Black radical tradition as this big tree or kind of wild growth that's going out. It's growing upwards. It's going in, all these elements are going in the same direction, but they might not all look exactly the same. There are going to be elements of it that are saying, why are you going slightly off in that direction? I believe you need to be over in this direction. And that's an ongoing, active, political, democratic process that happens within communities of people who have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And so the way it looks like in my life, in my family's life, in my own community of organizers within the Boston area is going to look slightly different than if it was for somebody else. And just as like the Black Lives Matter movement in Oakland is going to look slightly different than it does in New York. And so the Black radical tradition is sort of is aimed at that larger structure, but it is not monolithic.
So not like one common goal for everyone who considers themselves part of the Black radical movement?
I think the one common goal is we got to get free. The one common goal is that we want to work for a different and better society. That's the radical aspect of it. And I think that people are fairly united in that. As for how do we get there, there are differing opinions.
There was a question. Do you want to ask a question?
There's the question up? Yeah.
Oh yeah, so like how you were talking about how like police officers like even like kills like suspects, I guess you want to say, and like still get like paid leave. Like a something that I thought of. I just want to like get your opinion on it if it would work. So like I was thinking like because like I feel like the corruption comes from the internal like investigation because who is investigating the police officers? It's the police officers. So I feel like what if there were like third like party like organizations that were like non-biased views and like they investigated not only like the police officer killings but also like corporate like HR like like sexual like assault or like harassment in the workplace because like when you contact HR they don't actually work for you. I feel like they
work for the
bosses. I feel like because they're gonna call the boss and ask. So do you think like a third party like organization like that? Do you think that may come along? Like
I think what you're really naming, and I hear within this question is that you're recognizing a structural issue, right? There's a real temptation, and you can see it dominating the mainstream discussions of these issues of aiming towards individuals. There was this bad person who did this bad thing, and they were bad by nature, and we know it now by their action, and now we can sort of like identify them and how we're done. But in reality, what we have are institutional structures that are actually providing cover for these actions to take place. These are not necessarily bad actors, but they're responding to bad incentives. Like human beings are not going to do something like murder another human being unless they're responding to a specific incentive. Now, if the incentive is for everyone to be able to live and have their needs met, then I don't believe that there's going to be much of a movement, much of an incentive for anyone to kill anyone, right? I have my needs met. If I'm living through this world okay, I'm not going to look over and say I want that, or I'm not going to be blaming somebody for my inability to have that thing. And one of the things that happens with the criminalization of human beings is that you're basically scapegoating them. What they're doing and living in their conditions is they're manifesting an unjust structure within our country. I'm living in poverty. I don't have my needs met. Therefore, you're going to see things like illegal markets, black markets are going to emerge because you got to make a living. You got to do what you're going to do. But when you police that, when you say that people who are engaged in those activities are by nature criminal, now you have police officers who are seeing these not as just people just like them. They're operating under an incentive scheme that says you have to root out the criminals. You have to put the criminals away. You have to protect yourself from this person who is criminal and will kill you. And that is a completely wrong-headed way of approaching things. So I would go even a step further than what you propose. I think that I like the direction that you're thinking, and I like the direction where you're aiming. But the conclusion that I've come to is, especially looking at the history of professional policing in this country, is that we need to actually take a very brave look at that history. That started with slave patrols, y'all. Like, there was a professional police at the time in the early 1800s. There were deputized people who were tasked with finding that escaped property. Those illegally escaped black slaves. And that was later organized into the center of cities where large business magnates, like the steel industry in Pittsburgh, for example, where they needed to keep their workers in line. Their workers were not able to earn a living wage to take care of their family, and so they resisted that through mass labor organization and unionization. And when those people went on strike, there had to be a way of forcing that to be broken, and that force came from the first professional police forces. And that has eventually evolved into the police that we see today, but a lot of their actions can be fit within that framework of controlling an underclass. Where are the majority of police patrolling? In poor neighborhoods. Places where there are surplus labor, people who cannot find jobs, and therefore are engaged in illegal activities and now criminalized. And so I think a really honest examination of the nature and history of policing in this country might lead to the conclusion that we need to really ask our question about why it existed in this way. And if it is really, as my historical investigation has indicated, it is really there to protect the status of the elite, to protect the private property of those who own it, then I don't see a real need for it. Now, that's a radical position, but there is a movement within this country to abolish policing, to do prison abolition. That was actually a thing that almost happened in the early 1970s. It almost happened at the federal level of abolishing the prison system in this country because it was deemed as unnecessary. It was increasingly unnecessary.
What would you do with, people who were actually dangerous to society?
Again, I really believe that if you treat that as a human being who is moving in accordance to some ill-fitted incentive, or if they were moving in such a way that they felt that they needed to acquire something that they don't have, or if it's a combination of something like mental illness or something like that, that's a person who can be brought back into society. But to punitively remove them from society, to lock them up, often in solitary confinement, that's not a way to organize society, in my view. And these days, we went from 200,000 prisoners in this country in the early 1970s to the present population of 3 million people. That's an actual industry in this country. Mostly that's privately owned, and people are profiting off of that. The people who are in prison are essentially enslaved because by law, slavery is illegal, except for if you are in prison. All right, so the forest fires that are going on in California, those are being fought at $1 a day by prisoners that are leased to the state from private prisons. That's ugly. That's really disgusting in my view. And so I'm not here for reform of that system. If it's fundamentally unjust, I'm here for abolishment.
My daughter's giving me this, I told you. So here's an interesting question. As the U.S. is moving towards the shift from majority whites to majority minority, non-white, what do you think is going to happen with racial tensions?
Same as it ever was if we keep the structure as it is. If we ended up in a situation where there were no longer white people as we recognize them today 100 years from now, then that the definition of white has always been redefined. Jewish people, when they came here, they weren't white when they came in like 1860, 1870. But by 1920, 1930, they were white. When the Irish came in the 1890s, early 1900s, they weren't white. You want to do a fun Google search? Look for, do a Google Images search for no Irish allowed, and scroll through. What you'll find are oddly Africanized cartoon depictions of Irish people.
They look like leprechauns.
They look like black leprechauns.
Yeah.
All right, and that was a way of differentiating them, was to basically move them towards being black. But eventually the Irish became white. Irish people in this room, if you're here, you're white.
You were Irish before you were referred to as black Irish.
Right, exactly. But that was just because at that time they occupied that lowest rung, or close to that lowest rung. But eventually they were assimilated into white America because that minority was becoming the majority. Well, so a fraction of it now became white, and now the white has the majority in this country. And that's a fascinating thing to watch happen. If you're not convinced that race is not biological, look at the changing definition of what is white over time and tell me that that's biological. Like there was actual evolution of human beings over a couple hundred years that made a different kind of white. Like, come on. That was a definitional thing that was happening over time. But what did it mean for them to become white is the next important question to ascertain. And that comes back to that question about privilege, is that it's a small, yet somewhat significant payment that says, keep your head down and believe in this dream. You can become like the rulers over here, because you look like them, first of all, but also you're white. You're not down there. Those other people are. That's a persistent and very powerful narrative that serves as a sort of payment. And look, I don't think that anybody in this room signed up to get it, but you have it. And so the question is, what are you going to do with it? Trying to just link it back to the other questions.
Well, and why did you want to come talk to us here at Tunxis Community College about this?
I really wanted to talk to if I were to do this at Harvard, I'd be talking to people who are quite explicitly being trained to become the elite in this country. All right, I'm going to be real with y'all. Like, that's where I work. All right, I'm not giving up that job. It's a good job. It's a good gig. And if you can get it, you should take it. But you shouldn't take it and pretend that it's otherwise. All right, that is an institution that exists to train the elite to become the business leaders or the innovative technocrats of this country, or the politicians who are going to be in charge of running things and maintaining the status quo. I wanted to come here to talk to ordinary people, if I may say so. Like, I come from lower middle class. My family actually attained middle class for a number of years, and then the 2008 housing crisis hit, and we lost everything. My family lost it all, right? And my entire family started to kind of wake up at that moment. And that was sort of the seeds of my own journey on this. But I have a desire to talk to America, like actual America, not the elite America. And so that's why I'm really excited when you invited me to talk to people here.
Some personal questions for you. I mean, I guess that one was kind of personal too, but we had one that was, what is your motivation? And another one that was, what is your biggest accomplishment?
Biggest accomplishment. I think my biggest accomplishment that I'll have to think on that one. Thank you. No, I think that's accurate. My biggest accomplishment are my two sons. My sons are amazing human beings that didn't. I think that if they were just born into society and kind of just let into the default settings, I think that they would still be pretty cool people. But like, I always knew that I was going to love my kids, but I figured that once they became preteens or teenagers, that I didn't have to like them anymore. But I really like hanging out with my kids. I really like they ask great questions. I love having them ask me challenging questions. I love challenging them back. I love challenging them to go beyond their school assignments that are like really frankly quite boring very often, and I just feel for them, and I teach them how to not just half-ass some of their assignments. I teach them the value of quarter-assing some of them. All right? But after you're done quarter-assing that assignment, making sure that you don't get a 0, like, let's make sure you get a good grade, all right? Now I want us to go a little bit beyond it. All right, they hand you to this reading that talked about colonization in Africa, and it's like a paragraph long, and that's what you're gonna get. Like, now let's go dig in a little bit more. Let's go find some other sources and find out about it. Like, let's find out what the people there were doing, not the great leaders of the movement, but what were the additions of the people that led to that movement. Eventually they'll emerge a leader, but it's always the people who drive this. And so that's one of the, I like that. I like my kids. My motivation, my motivation is to get free. Like, my motivation is to work towards a world where human needs are met by default as a human right, like I said before. Where it is not legal to exploit the work and labor of other people to enrich yourself, but rather that people work together to make sure that everyone's needs are met together. That is an alien concept here in America, where individualism is key. Individualism is, the individual should work towards maximizing their own life outcomes alone. And if people happen to come along for the ride, if you become a job creator and you help a couple of the people along the way, then fine. But ultimately it's to maximize your own returns. That's not a good way to organize your society. I want I want to know that my kids are guaranteed to grow up to having their needs met, and the people around them too. And in so doing, we can actually have a society where you don't have to strive to find real life human connection. Like that's another basic human need, I believe. We're social creatures. We really do need each other. And when we can actually come as we are and be seen for who we are as human beings and engage in that way meaningfully, powerful stuff happens, and it's really beautiful to see. And so like that's another one of my motivations. That's what I want. In science, it can become very dry, it can become very sterile. You're kind of expected to work in your office and maximize your own research, get as much grant money you can for yourself. Those are the motivating factors. Those are the incentives that are put in place. There's no priority put on, like, who are these human beings who are doing this work? What is it actually motivating them, and why are they passionate? And can I share that with you? Can we work together on that? That's not the default setting within astronomy. It's not the default setting within science. It's not the default setting within academia. So yeah, I want to change that situation. It's a little bit selfish, frankly, but ultimately it's aimed at human connection so that we could all have that same thing.
Yeah. So on a larger level, Angela Davis said racism and capitalism are systematically connected, and Malcolm X said we can't have capitalism without racism. So, I mean, do you share this? There's like three parts to this. Do you share this view?
Okay.
Do you think that there's some connection between this and the movement on the part of many young people towards this embrace of socialism? And in countries that are more socialist, is there less racism?
Okay. I'll go first towards the origin of those quotes. You know, I'd say 5 years ago, I wouldn't have understood those. And I think I would have disagreed with them, actually, frankly. I would have just said, no, there's this thing called systemic racism. We need to end it. We need to abolish it and crush it and make sure that there's no more racism at a systemic level, structural level within this country. And it's that structural racism that gives rise to the racial bigotry on an individual level. And so I'd want to see all of that eradicated. And then people would ask me, like, oh, I share that vision. Like, how do we do that? How would that look? How would you structure society so that that happened? And I honestly, I would kind of say, like, let's work on that together. But I didn't have an answer. But when you look at the way that racism manifests within society, I talked about those two levels, and that leveling happens not necessarily on like perceived status. I really admire you more as being a part of this group than I admire these people less, and therefore, you know, you have a different status in my view. No, it manifests itself economically. Every single measure of economic health for Black America is a factor of 10 below the median value for white people in this country. And it's not, I'm not saying that all the white people are wealthy. That's not at all, I'm making a relative statement. But that factor of 10 has persisted all the way back from the abolition of slavery to the present time. It has never moved. And that locked in nature of it is embedded into the very economic system of our country. And when you rewind the clock to the origin of slavery, what was going on there? Within a market economy, and capitalism is a version of a market economy, the motivation or the incentive is to minimize the input that you have to spend to produce something to maximize the return that you get from selling it. Right? That's very basic economics. People call it the profit motive. I want to spend as little as I can to produce this bottle of water and then sell it for as much as I can so that all of the money that I invested in the plastic and the water itself gets covered, plus I get a profit on top of it, so that I maximize the return. Well, part of what goes into producing this bottle of water is that there was some worker in a factory who used their muscle and their brains to run a machine, to design that machine, to repair that machine, but to put work into this bottle of water. All right? So where does that chunk that comes back as profit goes? Well, A little bit of it goes back to the worker in the form of wage. The rest of it goes to the owner of Aquafina, whoever that is, or whatever board that is. That chunk goes up to there. Now, that part that goes as wage, that's called a labor cost. That's part of the cost of making something that you sell is the labor that you have to pay for it. If you minimize that, that leaves more profit. And what's the maximum amount that you can reduce the amount that you pay a worker? You can reduce it to 0. And what is that? Slavery. Okay? When slavery, in the South, there was a system of slavery where it was reduced down to 0. In the North, it was reduced down to a tiny wage. In the South, the worker was owned as property. In the North, well, the ability to do that work was owned. And after this system, the North beat the system in the South, then we still have that system today, which is now recognized as just simply capitalism. Now, a lot of people think that this is a fair way of doing things, and that's fine. I think we can have a discussion on that level. But to address that question, I really do believe that in order to maintain a system where people get paid so very little for their work, like here's a real statistic. For everybody who has a job or is going to leave this college and to have a career or have a job, the first 2 hours of your day are going to go towards the amount of money you need to live. The other 6 hours of your labor goes straight to the pockets of the board or whatever corporation you're working for. All right? And that is what's fascinating, is that our records of indigenous societies, the nations of people who lived here before the Europeans arrived, they worked on average 3 hours a day because they worked simply for their own subsistence. They worked so that they could live. That's all. They didn't work to generate a profit for their chiefs or their leaders of their society or the elite of their society. Everybody just worked together. And so, because you have a system where the labor, the muscle power and brain power that went into producing this product, most of it is essentially robbed from the worker, most people feel that at a gut level, which is why people slack off at work. It is an unconscious form of resistance that workers in this country do when they spend a good fraction of the day looking at Facebook instead of doing productive work. Like, we know it's bullshit, all right? And so, how do you keep people in line when the vast majority of people are having their labor exploited in that way? Well, the way you can do it is that divide and conquer that I was referring to before. That is the purpose that it still serves today. And so I believe that if you have that leveling of a society where, I'm not talking about stealing wealth, I'm talking about putting that wealth where it was earned. And you have a society where people work 3 hours a day, everybody has a place to live, everybody has nutritious food to eat, everyone has clean water to drink, you don't have to buy it. You no longer have to answer this question of why is it that we need to work in order to live when we live in a society full of technology that we have today. If people 400, 500, 600 years ago could work 3-hour days and live good lives, like the first settlers that came here, we can find in their journals and in the laws of those early colonies that there were laws against having people escape from those places where they were starving to go live with the native people. Those stockades, when people were like this, those were punishments for people who ran away to live better lives with the Indians, the so-called Indians, the Native Americans. All right? And so I believe that once you have a society that's organized in that way, in what way can racism manifest itself? Everybody's needs are already met. There's no more anger about not having your needs met, so there's nobody to blame. You don't need to go and turn and scapegoat people anymore. So you don't have this convenient group of people that play that role. You don't have a market that goes and has these plummets into recessions and depressions. And during that time, who serves as the shock absorbers when we have a housing crash of 2008? It hit disproportionately the black and brown folks, who also took the blame for it. All right, so I believe that once you remove that differentiation, once you remove that inequity from society, then there's no more structure to support racism. So that's my view. There's a question right there. You want to ask it?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You seem to praise the native society, which I understand, but they maintained a Stone Age level of technology. And do you think there's a reason that our society did not stay at a Stone Age level of technology, while as theirs sort of just stagnated?
Well, I mean, so Stone Age refers to like maybe the materials that they use, but they had technology. Technology is simply human beings recognizing a need and then solving the problem that produced that need so that they have. All right, and so indigenous societies, they had what they needed.
Yeah, but their quality of life is clearly much lower.
I don't, now it is, yeah, now when they're locked away on reservations, now when they have been systematically eradicated, and had their way of life eradicated to give rise to this country, yeah, their lives are not so great right now.
So,
But at that time, you can actually look into the journals of the people who were settling this country, and you could see that they preferred that life when they found it. That's a remarkable thing. And so the technology that we have today is not a product of necessarily the structure of our society. It's simply saying, oh, there's a need that needs to be met. Let's make this thing, a table, to meet that need. But if you can meet that need with more basic materials than plastic, which happens to ravage our environment, when you can do that with something that actually allows you to live sustainably with that environment, I'd say that's superior technology.
Are you actually insinuating that you would trade your life right now for a pre-colonial native life?
I would.
Like
Yeah,
without
if that society was egalitarian and it was not structured so that my labor had to be
vaccines,
sold.
without any,
That was a happier time.
medical
though.
anything?
Everyone was equal. Everyone shared their heart.
without wheels?
I have to interrupt just in case students have other classes.
you can
So it's 12:45, so we can stick around for a few minutes, right, if people want to ask questions. But otherwise, let's give Professor Johnson a big hand.